I'm delighted that Rabbi Jonathon Romain is in the studio. It's great to see you in person.
Hi.
You're a real boy. He's from the Maidenhead Synagogue, so thank you very, very much indeed for coming in. I wonder if there is actually a specific law on anti-Semitism in this country, because I don't think there is. And I wonder if you think the government should move immediately to introduce legislation on this, because the current legislation, as far as I can see, isn't working. We've had the Community Security Trust talking about over 4,000 anti-Semitic incidents. They've been monitoring this for 40 years. It's the worst they've ever seen. And I'm sure what's happening in Israel has, well, we know that what's happening in Israel has led to a real spike in anti-Semitic attacks. It's horrendous.
Yes, and you're quite right that anti-Semitism is one of those strange beasts that sort of lies low and then suddenly erupts, and very often it's because of what's happening in the Middle East, which is quite extraordinary because, yes, there's terrible things happening and there's suffering on both sides of the divide, but that's nothing to do with British Jews. And there's absolutely no reason why, if you care about what's happening in Gaza, why you should abuse 11-year-old school children in North London. And that is a good example of anti-Semitism. In other words, morphing from a political view about a foreign country, the other side of the Mediterranean, to taking it out on children on Britain's high streets. And I suppose, as to your point about a law, well, I mean, remember, anti-Semitism is racism. And people often forget that. They somehow it sort of slips under the radar as not being quite as bad or sort of a lesser problem. It's not. Anti-Semitism is a subset of racism. So if you're against racism, which hopefully most of your viewers are,
yes,
all of your viewers for that matter, then they should be against anti-Semitism. We've got to sort of pummel that message home. Anti-Semitism is racism. If you don't if you don't like insulting black people, brown people, or whatever, don't insult Jews either.
And that is fascinating, isn't it? Because you have a lot of people. It's not just on the left, but some of them are, who wouldn't dream of insulting a black person, for example, wouldn't dream of using some horrendous racial slur like the N-word or something like that, wouldn't dream of being homophobic, for example, but somehow think it's okay to be anti-Semitic. Is it something that's seen as acceptable around those dinner parties?
It's completely illogical. I mean, it's nuts. You know, it would be as stupid as if you know the person who shot people dead in the Kansas City Super Bowl was turned out to have blue eyes, and suddenly you start attacking blue-eyed people in Britain. You know, it's as daft as that. And I suppose the reason, because you have to look at what's happening, is partly because Jews in this country often are white. There are black Jews in elsewhere, but Jews are white. They are seen as, because Israel has a supporter in America, seen therefore as colonialist or imperialist, which sort of fits into the left-wing ideology. Actually, you know, Israel's quite a remarkable place. I mean, it's not the perfect place, so don't get me wrong, but it's a real melting pot of people from all ethnicities, all colours. You get black Jews, brown Jews, white Jews. You get people from all over the world. And curiously enough, who established Israel? Well, it was established by the United Nations in 1947. You know, most countries are established by wars, conquests. It is the most legitimate state out by international concern. And of course, you could also say, actually, it's the third state of Israel, because Jews have been there ever since the time of the Bible. That's about 2,000 years BC. So why it is labelled as imperialist or colonialist is to do with left-wing ideology.
Yeah, it's a very easy thing to call it a colonialist state when actually it's just not. I wonder if we could talk about political leadership in this country, if you don't mind, Rabbi. I wonder if you think, I mean, my view, I'll tell you my view, you tell me yours. Keir Starmer, to me, has done a lot over the last 4 years to try to rid Labour of the stain of anti-Semitism, which flourished, I'm afraid, under Jeremy Corbyn. Now, we've seen in Rochdale, there's an election there on the 29th of February, that anti-Semitism has reared its head again from one of the candidates, Azhar Ali, who was the Labour candidate. There's another parliamentary candidate who's been caught saying anti-Semitic things as well. There were people at that public meeting who sat there and let it happen, didn't stand up, didn't walk out, didn't say, no, we're not going to listen to this, or alternatively, you should stop saying that. When you see the undeniable progress that the Labour Party has made on this in the last 4 years, and then you see what happened in Rochdale, what runs through your mind?
It's disappointing. And I suppose the key question is, was what happened in Rochdale the last gasp of the sort of anti-Semitic dinosaurs in Labour, or was it the tip of the iceberg? It's very hard to know for sure, but I have to agree with you. You're spot on when you say Starmer has really made a difference. And if you think about what's happened since he took over, he's transformed the party, the image of the party hopefully the substance of the party. People like Louise Ellman have come back in. Jeremy Corbyn has been kicked out. And that's astonishing. He was the previous leader of the party, and who had massive rallies, and who was obviously very popular within a certain cohort of Labour, being cut out. Astonishing, really astonishing. And yet Starmer has done it, and of course he expelled Azhar Ali, which again was quite brave of him. People
Did he
argue
handle it right at the start?
Well,
I mean,
you can
he
argue.
allowed him to kind of, well, I mean, a lot of people are arguing this, Rabbi, because we've got we've got Azhar Ali, who said this. It was in the public domain last Sunday, actually, and then they stood by him even for 24 hours. They sent Pat McFadden out, their big election coordinator, to defend him.
Yes, I suppose, to be fair to Starmer, I mean, the initial thing was he criticised Israel, which is, it can be political, but then when he went on to talk about Jews in the media and controlling the media, that really crossed the red line.
Do you not think, in your estimation, the first thing that he said, this conspiracy theory that Israel brought the 7th of October attacks on themselves, which is clearly absolute nonsense, and knew about it, do you not think that by itself is anti-Semitic, or is that just anti-Israel?
It's in this grey area. I mean, it's totally bonkers. I mean, he's politically daft, and frankly, if I wouldn't want to have him in the party in the first place. And it says, is this man fit to be an MP? But all credit to Starmer, because he did get rid of him, and it means he's got a sort of hasn't got an official candidate in Rochdale.
Yeah.
So, he has taken hard decisions. So I think I, and I suspect most Jews, would say it's heading in the right direction. And if you look at now and 3 years ago, just light years away.
George Galloway is standing as well in Rochdale. We'll talk about I'll give the list, of course, of all of the different candidates at the end within all the rules that we need to do that in an election period. George Galloway is someone who has a controversial figure. He's been very, very vocal in his support for the Palestinian cause. He's travelled to the Palestinian territories on many occasions. I mean, do you think him becoming an MP would be something that Jews would fear, or would they be happy enough?
Yes, I mean, he's certainly taken a very vicious attitude to Israel and to Jews in general. I think he's regarded as not a nice character. Frankly,
I'm sure he'd deny a lot of that. I'm sure he'd deny being in any way anti-Semitic. I'm sure he'd deny not being a nice person.
Yes, I suppose, to be honest with you, if I was voting in any election, I would want my MP to talk about the cost of living or what's going on in this country. I wouldn't want them, ranting on about what's happening in Gaza. MPs are really here to look after what's going on locally. And Galloway is not someone who has proved himself to be an asset to British Parliament in the past when he was an MP.
Okay, I'm sure you deny that as well, and say it was a great asset to British Parliament, but we'll just be careful about what we say. But that's a totally legitimate view on George.
I mean, what's really interesting though is what happens in Kingswood, where actually not only did Labour win, but the candidate was someone who not only was Jewish, but converted to Judaism and has an Israeli husband. So, that is one of Keir Starmer's new MPs. So that really also says a lot about the new direction that Labour's heading in.
Someone who perhaps wouldn't have flourished in the party under Jeremy Corbyn, but of course we don't know that, but it would certainly appear to be the case. I wonder, Jonathon Romain, Rabbi Jonathon Romain here, if you could just tell me a little bit more about your impressions of the Community Security Trust's thoughts on evidence as well on anti-Semitic attacks. I mean, I think something like 4,500, and more than they've ever had in the last 40 years. I mean, we've had flare-ups certainly in the Middle East previously. You were saying earlier that what happens in Israel obviously has a direct effect on levels of completely inexcusable anti-Semitism in this country. But there have been other times when this has happened. Why do you think we're in this position now?
Purely because of what's happening in Israel. I mean, that's...
But we've had other events in Israel previously over those 40 years. I just wonder what's different about this one.
Well, it's very hard to know for sure. And what's really interesting is that it's not necessarily about what Israel has now done in Gaza, because the anti-Semitic attack started on October the 7th. In other words, the moment Hamas attacked Israel. And there was a 3-week period, remember, when Israel didn't do anything. It was sort of mobilising, but it hadn't actually gone into Gaza. So there was nothing to complain about Israel, so to speak, from its most ardent critics. And yet still there was this spike in anti-Semitic incidents. It's almost as if there's a latent anti-Semitism in some groups of society that were just waiting for an excuse and who suddenly got on the Hamas bandwagon. And what's really astonishing about that is actually, particularly people on the left who are pro-gay and pro-women's rights, which actually not just on the left, of course, but anyone who is should not get into bed with Hamas, who actually deny women's rights, who persecute people who are gay, and yet there's all this sort of woke support
Queers for Palestine.
Hamas.
Queers for Palestine, queer in support of
these are the
Hamas.
people who Hamas...
They would throw you off the top of a building for being gay.
Exactly. So you imagine, is this political stupidity?
Yes,
or is it
part of it,
or is it actually hatred?
I think it's both.
And if it is hatred, why? I mean, what have Jews done that sort of promotes it? Last night, I was at the production of Shylock's Merchant of Venice, and you know that famous speech by Shylock, hath not a Jew hands, eyes, organs, dimensions? Does the wind not blow us? Does the heat not, does the sun not heat us up? Does the rain not make us wet? And all that sort of stuff. Jews are very ordinary people, and yet somehow it provokes this latent dislike, and it's almost a dislike of the unlike, and it's partly to do with the past and Christian anti-Semitism, because, you know, unfortunately, Jews are the villains in the Christian story because of all the crimes you can commit. Committing murder is pretty bad, but killing the Son of God is the worst crime. Then you got that overtaken by Nazi ideology, that Jews were somehow racially different. And there's this terrible, toxic connection between Jews and evil. And it's just bonkers. And yet bonkers seems to be the name of the game today.
Yeah. In terms of those incidents, you're talking about 11-year-old children being, I mean, this is really, really serious, the stuff that's happening. Some of these attacks are just completely unforgivable, and there's just absolutely no justification for anti-Semitism ever. But when it spills over into protests outside primary schools, for example, Jewish primary schools, and the fact that, I mean, the daily life of many Jews in this country involves a lot of security, involves not just CCTV, but guards that are outside synagogues, that are outside schools and so on. I mean, just paint a little picture for us of what life is really like for some Jewish people.
Yes, I mean, it's not all terrible, I have to say, and in my own area, Maidenhead, it's relatively calm. It's we've got really, really good relations with the local communities. In fact, on October the 8th, the day after the Hamas attack, I got together with the local imam and also the local vicar. We each said a prayer for peace. Didn't change the world, but it was a clear signal to our communities not to import whatever's going on in the Middle East here, and that essentially it's a political problem rather than a religious one. But in other parts of the country, particularly the cities, London, Manchester, there are these horrendous incidents. Synagogues being targeted, Jewish schools being targeted, cemeteries being vandalised, school children, as you say, being abused. And you think, why? I mean, what kind of person is it that does it? I mean, what are they trying to achieve? And I mean, it's, you know, I'm a bit lost for words because it is so stupid, and yet, unfortunately, has a really nasty effect on people's everyday lives.
Talk to people who aren't Jewish. Talk to people like me. What can we do to help you and to be supporters, allies, in the most non-patronising and constructive way? How can people who aren't Jewish help Jewish people get through this really awful period of anti-Semitism?
The key thing is to call it out. So when you're in conversation, at the bus stop, at a dinner party, wherever, and somebody makes an anti-Jewish joke, you say, well, that's not very nice, is it? Or somebody says a remark about Jews, you say, well, why do you say that? Just not abuse them, but just challenge them. What do you mean by that? Why do you say that? What's your thinking behind that? And time again, then they'll say, oh, yeah, and people often do these knee-jerk stuff, and you need to call it out and stop it, and remind people, anti-Semitism is racism. If you're anti-racist, you must be against anti-Semitism.